You think your apartment sucks? Try sleeping in a fire trap the size of a broom closet, with a ceiling that leaks, floors that collapse, and neighbors who dump their waste, yes, that kind, out the window. Welcome to the Roman Insula, the ancient world's answer to how can we cram the maximum number of miserable humans into one creaking death box. No elevators, no insulation, and oh yeah, no fire codes. If you're not crushed by your neighbor's collapsing ceiling beam, the overnight smoke inhalation might get you, and somehow, this was a step up for most people. Still think you're tough enough for ancient Rome? Hit subscribe and buckle in. We're diving deep into the soot-choked stairwells of history's most flammable rental market. If you've ever complained about your apartment's thin walls or your upstairs neighbor's interpretive tap dancing at 2 a.m., allow me to introduce you to the Roman Insula, the architectural equivalent of a death wish wrapped in adobe and wishful thinking. These weren't just homes, they were stacked coffins with rent due. Multi-story tenements towering over ancient Rome, held together with mud, timber, and whatever prayers the builders could mutter before payday. Now imagine being wedged into one of these structures, maybe on the 6th floor if you're lucky, and by lucky I mean poor and desperate. You've got about 10 square meters of living space, a roommate with flatulence and dreams of becoming a street poet, and zero insulation separating you from the outside world, or the inside one for that matter. Soundproofing. That's adorable. You'll hear everything: sobbing, arguing, childbirth, drunken philosophy, and bowel movements. Lots of that. Insulae were the ancient Roman solution to urban sprawl and skyrocketing population. Rome wasn't just a city, it was the city. Over 1 million people crammed within its dusty, smelly, magnificent limits. And most of them didn't live in a sprawling marble villa with a citrus orchard. No, they were jammed into these precarious vertical sardine cans. Let's do a little mental walkthrough, shall we? You enter through a narrow alley, more of a suggestion of space than an actual passage. The entrance, a door barely wide enough to squeeze through with your dignity intact. There's no lobby, no welcome mat, just a stairwell that looks like it was designed by someone who hated angles and people. You take a deep breath, immediately regretting it, because someone dumped their chamber pot nearby, and start the climb. Upward. Always upward. If you're on the bottom floor, congratulations. You're either slightly better off, or working in the workshop that doubles as someone's bedroom. These ground floor apartments were often shops or taverns, which meant noise, foot traffic, and the occasional knife fight. But at least you wouldn't plummet to your death if the ceiling decided to take the day off. The higher you go, the worse it gets. Less space, more heat in the summer, more chill in the winter, and a growing sense that your building is one strong sneeze away from collapse. But you're not here for the ambience. You're here because it's the only place you can afford after selling olives at the market 6 days a week while dodging pickpockets and your landlord. And, oh yes, the landlord. Don't picture a kindly old man collecting coins with a gentle cough and a heartfelt thank you. Picture a toga-wearing loan shark with a penchant for evictions and a side hustle in gladiator betting. These were not the most ethical souls. Many of them lived in luxurious villas across the city while you haggled over rent from a crawl space. But hey, at least you're not alone. No one was alone. Ever. Privacy was about as real as a unicorn in a toga. You lived cheek by jowl with other tenants. Entire families would squeeze into single-room units, stacked on top of one another like lasagna from hell. You knew your neighbors intimately. Their habits, their arguments, their digestion. You were a captive audience to the great Roman play, with no exit. And just outside, the street bustled with vendors shouting, children crying, donkeys braying, and drunk senators urinating wherever they pleased. It was noise layered over noise. Rome was alive. But that life was never quiet. Now, you may be wondering, were Insula all this bad? Surely someone had a decent place to live. Sure, they were called domus, and they were palaces compared to your flammable rectangle. Owned by the wealthy, these houses were ground level, sprawling, adorned with mosaics, courtyards, and fountains. Meanwhile, your insula had a cracked clay pot you shared with two other tenants and a vague mildew problem that might actually be sentient. And here's a fun fact to make your skin crawl. Roman laws limited the height of insulae after too many of them, well, collapsed. Builders had a habit of pushing higher and higher, 7, 8 stories, sometimes more, because more height meant more rent, until it didn't, because the building was now rubble. Which brings us to the unsettling reality. Every Roman living in an insula knew that one day the whole structure might just go, snap, boom, timber and brick cascading down like ancient confetti, and you, dear tenant, just trying to sleep through the screaming of the upstairs toddler, would suddenly become an archaeological footnote. So why did anyone live in these things? Because Rome was the empire's beating heart. Because jobs, food, opportunity, all of it pulsed from the city. Because if you weren't born rich, you took what you could get, and what you got was the... Still, despite the grime and danger and constant threat of fiery death, life carried on. People loved here, fought here, wrote poetry, burned stew, tucked children in. It wasn't glamorous, but it was life, and that's something. But wait, remember those cozy timber supports we mentioned? The ones holding your ceiling up? Let's just say they have a tendency to catch fire, especially when combined with oil lamps, straw mattresses, and your downstairs neighbor who insists on roasting fish indoors. What happens when your building decides it's done pretending to be a building? We'll get there. If there was ever a phrase that captured the Roman approach to housing the working class, it was this: good enough. The ancient insula wasn't built to last. It was built to exist just long enough to collect rent and hopefully not kill anyone this week. The Romans may have pioneered roads, aqueducts, and concrete engineering. But when it came to tenement construction, let's just say your average Lego house had better stability. Welcome to the thrilling world of ancient real estate, where landlords were just one toga away from being cartoon villains. These weren't your helpful Mr. Feeney types. They were more how many tenants can we stack before the laws of physics give up. Their goal wasn't safety, it was verticality. More height, more rooms, more rent, and structural integrity, optional, maybe even discouraged. Let's get technical for a second. Don't worry, it's still awful. Most insulae were built using a combination of wood, brick, and whatever happened to be lying around. Lower floors might get sturdy stone or fired bricks, but by the time you reached the 4th, 5th, or 6th floor, they were tossing in mud bricks and timber beams like it was a group art project gone horribly wrong. Load-bearing walls? Debatable. Fireproofing? Absolutely not. Why such architectural audacity, you ask? Because the Roman construction industry was basically the Wild West. If the Wild West had worse zoning laws and more togas, there was no OSHA, no permits, no inspection. Builders operated on a system known as don't get caught, and even when they were caught, the consequences were laughable. Slap on the wrist, small fine, maybe a stern look from a magistrate, then back to stacking bricks with the enthusiasm of a toddler on a sugar high. One ancient source, Vitruvius, Rome's closest thing to an HGTV host, wrote entire treatises on how buildings should be built. Guess how many builders followed that? Roughly 0, because taking your time and doing it right costs money. And money, as always, was better spent on not things like quality materials or fireproof mortar. Now, Rome did eventually realize this was a problem. After several spectacularly fatal collapses and fires, Emperor Augustus passed laws limiting how tall insulae could be. Initially, the cap was around 70 Roman feet, roughly 7 modern stories. Then it was reduced to 60 feet. And did that help? Not really. Builders just fudged the numbers, bribed officials, or played semantic games. Oh no, Emperor, this isn't one building, it's a series of artistic vertical pods. And here's where it gets spicy, literally. The choice to use wood for floors, stairs, and internal supports turned each insula into a kindling stack. Combine that with open flame lamps, tightly packed dwellings, and residents using fire indoors for cooking and heating, And what you've got is less home and more ancient Roman matchstick. It wasn't if a fire would break out, it was when. In fact, fire was such a frequent visitor that Rome had its own version of firefighters, known as the vigiles. At first glance, that sounds reassuring. But don't get too cozy. The vigiles were underfunded, undermanned, and had about the same level of enthusiasm as a teenager asked to clean the garage. Their strategy often involved knocking down other buildings to stop the spread, which, you guessed it, was also not great if you happened to live in one of those sacrifice zones. So now let's imagine a day in the life of a Roman tenement builder. You wake up, grab some stale bread, and get to work slapping mud bricks into place. You skip measurements, ignore symmetry, and eyeball the support beams. Then you top it all off with a nice wooden roof, and maybe, if you're feeling extra lazy, forget to install chimneys entirely. That's a future tenant's problem. And the landlords. They loved this. They weren't looking to create architectural masterpieces. They were looking to crank out cookie-cutter rentals as fast as possible. Think ancient Rome's version of a 2,000-unit luxury condo slapped together overnight with the structural soul of wet cardboard. Tenants would die, buildings would fall. But the landlord, still rich, still untouchable. So what happened when things went wrong? Well, if a building collapsed, it was mostly treated like a natural disaster, tragic, unfortunate, but not exactly a crime. And fire? That was just Rome being Rome. Landlords rarely faced consequences unless they'd somehow offended someone powerful. And the tenants? They were lucky if they escaped with their lives and their sandals. Even the term Insula, which originally meant island, tells you something. These weren't just buildings. They were little isolated worlds of misery, bobbing in the ocean of Rome's chaos. Each one built just fast enough to cash in on the imperial city's endless flood of workers, migrants and dreamers. Dreams that usually ended somewhere between top-floor collapse and smoke inhalation. And yet, people still moved in, because Rome was the empire's beating heart, and Insula were the only way most people could plug into that rhythm. You took your chances, because the alternative was worse. Life in the countryside might be quieter, but it came with fewer opportunities, less excitement and even more poverty. At least in the city, you had a shot, or so the thinking went. Still, let's ask the obvious question. If you had to pick a floor in a Roman insula, would you go high or low? Up high, you've got the worst rooms, but you're spared the street noise and possibly the sewage smell. Down low, you've got easier access, maybe a better breeze, and a fighting chance to escape when the building inevitably tries to murder you. But of course it's not really your choice. Not in ancient Rome. Your income chooses for you, your status, your birth. If you're poor, and odds are you are, you live wherever you're told, however dangerous it may be, because in a world built on inequality and speed, safety was a luxury reserved for the rich and statuesque. And that, dear viewer, is how an empire famous for engineering also became famous for death by sealing. So the next time your landlord takes 3 weeks to fix a leaky faucet, just be thankful you don't have to worry about your apartment spontaneously combusting while you're eating dinner. But if you think the materials were bad, wait until we talk about what you had to climb to get to your room. Because next we're tackling the Insula staircase, an ancient game of chance disguised as architecture. If you've ever whined about your 5th floor walk-up in Brooklyn, allow me to escort you to the Roman equivalent, a spiraling vertical death spiral known as the Insula staircase. These weren't stairs, they were more like a dare, a narrow, creaking wooden ladder to heaven, except without the heaven part. Just splinters, fire risk, and the existential dread of gravity. In theory, a staircase should help you ascend with dignity. In an insula, it was a multi-sensory assault. Imagine a tunnel barely wide enough for one person, coiled like a snake in a dark, foul-smelling shaft. The walls sweat. The stairs groan. You hold your breath because the man ahead of you smells like he lost a fight with a vat of spoiled garum. And worst of all, there are no windows. just the damp sigh of 1,000 lives pressing down from above. These staircases were the main arteries of Insula life, and they were absolutely miserable, built from flammable wood, unlit and completely unregulated. They were both a literal and social ladder, because in ancient Rome, the higher your apartment, the lower your status. That's right, living on the top floor wasn't some penthouse dream. It was rock bottom. Why? Let's do the math. The ground floor, called the tabernae, was prime real estate. It might be a shop, a tavern, or, if you were lucky or rich, an actual apartment with access to water and minimal risk of falling several stories in your sleep. The first and second floors weren't bad either, sometimes even had their own latrines, but the further up you went, the worse it got. And by the time you reached the top, well, let's just say you were living in the clouds of smoke and disappointment. Why was this the case? It's all about convenience and escape velocity. Lower floors meant quicker access to the street, to goods, to water, and most importantly, to the exit when everything inevitably caught fire. Higher floors meant longer hikes, worse insulation, and no hope of escape if flames came knocking. Yet these were the spaces the poor called home. So what was that daily climb like? So you've made it up 5 splintery, fire-prone flights of Roman real estate, and into your cozy, smoke-stained cube. You've survived the stairs, you've ignored the smell, and now you have to go. Like really go. But there's just one small civilization-crushing problem. The ancient Roman equivalent of indoor plumbing didn't extend to you, peasant of the upper floor. Welcome to one of the most overlooked yet horrifying realities of life in a Roman insula. The total absence of a personal bathroom. Let's say you're optimistic. You look around your room. No latrine, no drainage pipe, no little hole in the floor that could pretend to be a toilet. Just a chipped jug, a damp corner, and some wishful thinking. So, like most people, you reach for your chamber pot, a glorified bucket that has seen things it never deserved to see. You do your business, possibly while listening to your neighbor do their business. And then comes the question of disposal. Now, here's where it gets darkly comical. You could lug that pot down 5 flights of misery, through the screeching baby corridor and the vinegar-scented stairwell, out into the street, and empty it into the public latrine, if there's one nearby. And if it's not already overflowing like a failed municipal fountain, but you're tired, your knees hurt, and so, like many insular residents, you do the unthinkable. You dump it out the window. Yes, really. Ancient Roman streets weren't just bustling marketplaces, they were also rivers of raw human waste. The Roman Empire gave us law, literature, and aqueducts, but for the average apartment dweller, the waste disposal strategy was gravity plus aim. There were laws against this. To be fair, citizens were technically required to shout "Cave Canon" or "Watch out below" before tossing their personal Niagara filth. But surprise, most people didn't bother. Maybe they were shy, maybe they were lazy, maybe they just got a thrill from hearing someone scream, "By Jupiter's armpit, what was that?" So let's zoom out. Rome had one of the most sophisticated sanitation systems in the ancient world. It had public latrines, underground sewers, running water, a veritable marvel of pre-modern engineering. But all that genius, reserved for public spaces, temples, villas, not for you and your 7th floor breadcrumb hovel. Instead, your options were chamber pot to the window, hike to the latrine, use a designated corner of your shared stairwell, like some kind of sentient raccoon. And speaking of public latrines, let's not romanticize them. These were long stone benches with holes carved side by side, often lacking privacy screens. You'd sit shoulder to shoulder with strangers, making small talk while handling big business. There was no toilet paper. Instead, there was the tersorium, a communal sponge on a stick, rinsed in a bucket of salt water, a single sponge. Many people. One stick. Pause and think about that. And don't even get me started on hygiene. Between the flies, the smell, and the occasional rat auditioning for a role in your nightmare, these places were less public convenience and more disease exchange lounge. Cholera wasn't even discovered yet, and somehow the Romans were already playing speedrun with it. If you were lucky enough to live on the lower floors, you might have access to a rudimentary indoor pipe system, essentially a ceramic drain that led in theory into the Cloaca Maxima, Rome's grand sewer. But in practice, many of these pipes simply opened into the street, or into the crawl space below your building, which naturally means the entire neighborhood had the aroma of warm despair. So now imagine you're trying to sleep. It's midnight. Someone on the floor above empties their pot with reckless abandon. There's a splash. There's a scream. There's a very wet morning ahead for your sandals. That, friends, is your morning commute, dodging literal filth while praying the gods of drainage are on your side. And let's not forget the impact on health. With no hand washing, no soap, and waste baked under the summer sun. The Insula wasn't just unpleasant. It was a bacterial playground. Dysentery, typhus, parasites, and other diseases spread like gossip at a toga party. You weren't just inhaling smoke, you were inhaling centuries of bad plumbing decisions. But here's the wildest part. For all this dysfunction, Romans cared about cleanliness. Public bathhouses were popular, perfume was everywhere, and grooming was an obsession. It's just that the line between personal hygiene and public squalor was paper thin, if that paper had been soaked in sewage and left to dry. Now, in case you're wondering how this system functioned without mass revolt, it didn't really. Fires, plagues, and building collapses weren't anomalies. They were the monthly highlights. Yet people endured, because when you're poor, survival often means accepting the unacceptable and calling it home. Cliffhanger time. We've talked about what goes out in a Roman insula, but what about what goes in? How did people store food, cook meals, and avoid setting the whole building on fire in the process? Well, they didn't always. So you've relieved yourself out the window, classy move by the way, and now your stomach's growling. Time for dinner. The problem? You live in a matchbox stacked on other matchboxes, built by a man whose idea of architecture was stack bricks until someone yells stop. The air is smoky, the floorboards creak like they're practicing for a tragic opera. And your kitchen? Oh, sweet naivete, you don't have a kitchen. Roman insulae weren't designed for domestic bliss. Most residents couldn't afford the space or the risk of cooking indoors. Fire was the ever-present roommate, the one no one invited but everyone feared. If you dared to cook in your tiny upper floor room, it meant bringing open flame within arm's length of your straw mattress, your drying laundry, and your neighbor's bad decisions. Still, hunger doesn't care about safety. So what do? You light the coals, mutter a prayer to Vesta, and try to cook something that won't kill you or everyone else in the building. Maybe you've got some barley porridge going, maybe a few chickpeas. If you're lucky, really lucky, you've scored a fish from the market that hasn't begun its transformation into soup of rot. But cooking indoors wasn't the norm for most. Instead, Romans relied on thermopolia street-side food stalls that were the ancient version of fast food, minus the drive-through, and plus a lot more rats. These vendors served up hot stews, lentils, cheese, and mystery meat in various shades of grey. Think food truck meets petri dish. And this stuff? It was popular. Not because it was good, but because it was there. You could grab a quick bite before a shift at the tanner's workshop, or after a long day of shouting over children and sewage. No fridge, no microwave, no Uber Eats, just a lukewarm bowl of fish stew and a vague hope that it didn't double as a laxative. Now let's talk about what's in that food. Not metaphorically. Literally, the grain, stored in communal warehouses, often crawling with mice, insects, and the occasional dead pigeon. The fish, dried, salted, and sometimes fermented into garum, a fish sauce that could strip paint and somehow made it into everything. And the water, let's just say if you were lucky it was laced with a little lead from Rome's famously advanced plumbing. If you were unlucky, it was piped from a cistern where things went to die. Frogs, bugs, that one lost sandal from a week ago. Parasites were a daily part of the dining experience. Intestinal worms were so common. Roman medical texts gave them cute nicknames. Some folks even considered them a natural part of life, like house guests, but ones that lived in your lower intestine and refused to leave. And food poisoning, that was less rare emergency and more Tuesday. Imagine you're eating street lentils from a cracked clay bowl. A fly buzzes by. You swat it, shrug, and keep going. That fly, it just came from someone's dumped chamber pot, landed on your spoon, and is now living its best microbial life on your tongue. Bon appetit. And yet, this wasn't unusual. This was normal. Dinner in a Roman insula wasn't a ritual of connection. It was survival with seasoning. Families huddled in corners, passing wooden bowls, swatting away flies while hoping the fish didn't taste too tangy. Children ate with dirty hands. Adults drank watered-down wine because water alone wasn't trusted. Not because of tradition, but because wine at least killed some of the bacteria. Let's pause for a moment. Picture this. It's evening. The sun has dipped below the skyline of uneven rooftops and swaying laundry lines. Inside your room, it's dim, hot, and smells like sweat and lentils. You're eating by lamplight, listening to the coughs of your neighbor who's been sick for days. Is it tuberculosis? Maybe just dust in the lungs. Either way, your appetite keeps twitching like a nervous eye. Modern comparison? Ever had food poisoning from a questionable bodega sandwich? Multiply that by tetanus, sprinkle in some tapeworms, and chase it with water that tastes like antique metal. That's dinner in an insula. And guess what? You paid for this. Now, before you assume the Romans were clueless about health, no, they weren't. They had a complex system of dietetics, a rich culture of medicine, and enough garlic to stun a boar. But the knowledge wasn't equally shared. The elites dined in tiled courtyards with imported wines. You, the tenement dweller, were one undercooked bean away from an intestinal saga. And diseases? Oh, they feasted right alongside you. Cholera, typhoid, tapeworms, trichinosis. You didn't just eat to survive. You gambled every bite. And if your neighbor upstairs had a stomach bug, you'd know, because one shared latrine, one poorly cleaned sponge stick, and bam, you're all on the same sick bed. Despite all this, people lived, laughed, ate. Food was still a comfort, a social glue, a brief moment of warmth in a city that otherwise treated you like background noise. Even amid the coughing and the rats and the constant fear of building-wide inferno, people found ways to gather and eat. Still, if your appetite's starting to fade, you might want to lie down and digest. But careful, night is falling. And in an insula, that's when things start to really creep. Night in a Roman insula doesn't fall. It oozes, thick, quiet, and unsettling. The city hum fades into a distant murmur. The street hawkers go home. The bread sellers close up shop. And the last echo of a donkey's bray slips into the sky. In the silence, another sound creeps in. The soft, menacing groan of your ceiling, and suddenly the darkness feels less like rest and more like a warning. You lie on your back, staring up at a roof made of wooden beams, older than Julius Caesar's social life. You wonder, not for the first time, if tonight's the night it all gives in. Because here's the thing about insulae. They didn't like nighttime. Wooden stairs, brittle mortar, dry kindling in every direction. It was like living inside a tinderbox someone forgot to label. And after sunset, that sense of fragility becomes painfully loud. You hear everything. Footsteps above you, 2 floors up, and still somehow stomping like an elephant parade. A distant argument in Latin that devolves into drunken sobbing. Someone sneezes violently. A dog barks, then yelps, then stops. And then there's the coughing. There's always coughing, wet, deep, bone-shaking. You start to wonder if you've caught something or just inhaled 2 centuries of structural decay. By now, You've wrapped yourself in the finest blanket 3 cestus could buy, which is to say, a piece of woven regret and goat hair. It itches. It smells faintly of vinegar, but it's warm enough, or it will be, once the draft stops slapping you across the face like a disappointed gladiator. You shift your weight, trying not to disturb the floorboards. The wood groans, always with the groaning. You swear your room sags just slightly more than it did last week. Your foot brushes the wall. It's damp, possibly alive. You stop moving. Now imagine this scene repeating itself across hundreds of rooms, stacked atop one another. Some people are whispering bedtime stories to children. Others are eating late, the smell of scorched chickpeas wafting through the cracks. Somewhere, someone is making love, enthusiastically and loudly, as is Roman custom. And somewhere else, someone is dying, quietly, from illness, or old age, or just bad luck and bad air. Let that sink in. You live in a structure where love, death, food, sleep, childbirth, drunken brawls, and existential despair are all happening at once. And you hear everything through walls that might as well be made of parchment and spit. But the worst part, the not knowing, the lurking fear that something could go wrong, will go wrong, and you won't be able to stop it. A single lamp tipping over, the kitchen fire left smouldering, the support beam weakened from last week's rain. One wrong move, and the entire building becomes a flaming obituary. And what will you do if it happens? There's no back door, no fire escape. The stairs? Gone first, like a matchstick in a fireplace. Your only option, the window, which is fine if you're on the 2nd floor. If you're on the 6th, it's more of a gamble. You'll survive the fire or the fall, but not both. Sleep doesn't come easily in a place like this. It arrives only when exhaustion wins. Your body caves in, surrendering to the weight of worry and the relentless buzz of city life pressing in from every side. Your dreams? They're strange, fragmented, half-formed images of street vendors and collapsing ceilings. You dream of running, but the stairs never end. At some point in the night, you wake up. You don't know why. There's no sound, no movement, just a sudden awareness, like the building itself has inhaled. You lie still, heart thudding, eyes wide, and then crack. Not loud, just enough. A shift in the wood, a warning sigh from the bones of the Insula. You stare at the ceiling. You listen for the second crack. It doesn't come. Maybe it won't. Maybe not tonight. Eventually dawn begins to push its way in, pale and reluctant. The city stirs, vendors set up shop. Children cry. The stairwell creaks with movement again. Life resumes, as if the night was just a pause. As if nothing tried to kill you, as if the entire city wasn't built on a stack of hopeful denial and flammable optimism. Reflective pause. Imagine not knowing if you'll wake up buried under bricks or breathing ash. Imagine sleeping with one eye open, not from paranoia, but because history says that's just smart planning. And imagine doing it night after night, without knowing any other life, because this is home. It's not good, it's not safe, but it's yours. And somehow, against all odds, people lived like this. Raised families, fell in love, laughed, fought, slept, endlessly aware that the night was never just rest. It was roulette, and the house always had termites. But don't get too cozy, because tonight might have been quiet. But tomorrow might bring the heat. The kind that doesn't come from a blanket. Let's talk comfort. Or, rather, the complete and utter absence of it. Because in a Roman Insula, the temperature wasn't just a background detail. It was a full-blown antagonist in your daily survival story. You weren't simply hot or cold. You were baked or frozen, with no thermostat in sight, and exactly zero sympathy from the weather gods. Rome wasn't built for subtle seasons. Summers were scorching, winters were bitter, and your insula, made from whatever materials the builder found lying around and could stack fast enough to meet his quota, offered all the climate control of a broken tent flap. Let's start with summer, The Roman sun didn't so much shine as it bludgeoned, and heat rises. Every Insula dweller knew that painfully well. The higher up you lived, the hotter your room. Top floor residents could fry an egg on the wall, assuming they had an egg and weren't too busy hallucinating from dehydration. Insula walls were typically made from mud brick and wood materials, which, to the surprise of absolutely no one, retained heat like a clay pizza oven. No shade, no ventilation, just you, a sweat-soaked tunic, and the gentle crackle of your sanity warping in the midday air. If you wanted relief, you had two options: open the shutters and pray for a breeze, or head to the communal fountains and dunk your head like a very desperate pigeon. But of course everyone else had the same idea, so you'd probably be elbowing a dozen equally smelly citizens for a splash of tepid runoff. And the smell. Let's not forget the olfactory nightmare of summer in Rome. Rotting garbage, human waste, fermented fish sauce, plus thousands of unwashed bodies, all simmering together in a city-wide pressure cooker. It was like living in a soup made of sweat and poor decisions. Now shift to winter. In theory, Rome's winters weren't Arctic-level brutal. In practice, your insula made sure you felt every freezing breath like a slap to the lungs. No insulation, no glass windows, just wooden shutters and a draft that could whistle through your bones like a street performer with asthma. You'd layer up tunic, cloak, maybe a spare wool blanket if you hadn't pawned it last week for lentils. Fires? Risky business. Most people didn't dare light anything indoors unless they were ready to reenact the Great Fire of 64 CE on a personal scale. Instead, you huddled close to your family or your neighbors, sharing heat and the occasional flea. And speaking of pests, let's be honest. Cold weather didn't scare the lice, or the rats, or the mold that crept along your walls like it was trying to form a union. Your insula wasn't a fortress against the elements. It was more like a sieve designed to let in just enough misery to keep you humble. But wait, what about seasons in between? Oh, those were the fun ones. The wet season turned your insula into a damp sponge. Roofs leaked, walls wept, floors warped. If you lived high up, the wind howled through your shutters like a vengeful ghost. If you lived low, you got floods. Beautiful, brown, sewage-scented floods. Your sandals squelched, your belongings floated. It was charming, really, like a rustic spa, but with dysentery. Let that sink in. Literally, if you're on the ground floor. There were no cozy hearths, no radiators, no heated floors. Roman heating technology, hypocausts, did exist, but they were for the rich, the domus crowd. Your average Insula tenant was lucky if their apartment retained body heat from the previous tenant, and often the only warmth available came from sheer crowd density. So what did people do? They adapted, wore extra layers, slept huddled, got used to sweating, shivering and shivering again. Sometimes all in the same week. They learned to read the sky like a mood ring. Grey clouds meant water buckets. Blue skies meant sunstroke, and somehow, amid all this, life went on. People still fell in love. Children still played, albeit while wrapped in every tunic they owned. Tradesmen worked. Bakers baked. Everyone grumbled. And when someone complained about the cold, the heat, the stink, the damp, someone else would shrug and say, "At least it's not on fire." Which, speaking of, what happens when fire meets weather? When dry timber collides with summer heat, and one misplaced oil lamp decides to fulfill its destiny? Fire. Always fire. You've survived the stairs. You've battled lice, stale lentils, and neighbors who treat quiet hours as a personal insult. You've frozen in winter and simmered like stew in the summer. But now we arrive at the true boss battle of Roman insular life. Fire. Unannounced, unstoppable, and absolutely inevitable. You see, fire wasn't just a hazard in ancient Rome. It was a lifestyle, a feature, the unofficial deity of the working class, equal parts terrifying and familiar. Romans didn't ask if a fire would break out. They asked when, and whether they'd be awake enough to outrun it. Let's set the scene. Your apartment is made of wood covered in cloth, decorated with oil lamps, and crammed with bodies and belongings. The stairwells are narrow, the exits are few. The roof beams are so dry they practically creak in Latin. Add to that, your downstairs neighbor cooking fish stew over an open flame next to a stack of firewood, and surprise. You now live inside a bonfire recipe. And here's the cruel irony. Everything you needed to survive made the place more flammable. Wool blankets, straw mattresses, woven baskets, papyrus scrolls, dried herbs, all packed into a space the size of a modern bathroom stall. It's not just fuel, it's kindling with dreams. When fire hit an insula, it hit fast. Flames leapt up the stairwells like they were late for something. Smoke filled every crevice. There were no sprinklers, no fireproof doors, no alarm system. You either woke up to the smell of smoke or the sound of people screaming, and if you lived on the upper floors, congratulations, you were now trapped in a chimney. The Vigiles Rome's firefighting force were supposed to help, and to their credit, they tried, but these were not trained professionals with helmets and hoses. They were slaves or low-ranking citizens with buckets, axes, and about as much coordination as a drunk centurion in a pottery shop. Their main method of firefighting: tearing down surrounding buildings to stop the fire from spreading. Yes, you read that right. If your neighbor's insula was burning, the Vigiles might destroy yours to create a firebreak, a controlled demolition. Except it wasn't that controlled, or timely, or effective. Picture a man with a hammer shouting for the Republic as he smashes your bedroom wall while you're still packing. This leads us to the main event, the Great Fire of You've heard of it. Probably blamed on Nero and his questionable musical hobbies. But what really happened? A fire broke out in the merchant shops near the Circus Maximus and spread like gossip at a Senate scandal. It burned for over a week. 2/3 of Rome was damaged or destroyed. Insulae went up like they were dipped in lamp oil, and many of them probably were. The destruction was biblical. People fled with whatever they could carry. Children, goats, jars of pickled turnips. Some didn't make it. Others barely escaped with their lives, coughing and ash-covered, watching everything they owned vanish into smoke. And the rebuilding process? A joke. Slumlords rebuilt quickly and badly again, because speed meant profit. Nero did try to introduce fireproofing regulations, wider streets, stone construction, limits on building height. Some were followed, most were ignored, because cost always beat caution. Rome wasn't built in a day, but it was often rebuilt in a week, poorly. Still watching? You're braver than most insular residents. Might as well like and subscribe while you're at it. Now let's get a little more personal. Imagine waking up to heat, licking your toes, and smoke curling under your door. You scramble for the stairs, already blocked. The window's too high to jump, too narrow to squeeze through. You grab your child, or your goat, or your best clay cup, and you run for the roof. Maybe you can scream for help, but it's chaos. People are stampeding. Timber is cracking. A scream turns into silence, and the world glows red. That was the nightly risk of insular living. And yet, people stayed, not because they were stupid, but because they had no other option. Rome was the empire's heart, and the insulae, its wheezing, flammable lungs, they provided shelter, barely. And when one burned down, another was built on top of it. Same spot, same design, same inevitable future. Because fire didn't just burn down buildings, it burned down the illusion of safety. And in Rome, safety was a luxury, not a right. So sleep tight. And keep a bucket nearby. If you thought getting incinerated in your sleep was bad, wait until you met your landlord, because in ancient Rome, nothing burned quite like the sensation of paying rent for a room that might collapse on you again. Welcome to the monthly reminder that poverty isn't just inconvenient, it's contractual. Let's begin with some economic heartbreak. Rent in a Roman insula was rarely stable and never reasonable. There were no leases, no tenant rights, and certainly no rent caps. You paid what the landlord demanded, often inflated on a whim, or because your new upstairs neighbor was richer and clueless enough to say yes. Negotiation? Only if you enjoyed being evicted or mysteriously reported for tax evasion. And what did you get for your hard-earned denarii? A room with cracks in the wall, a ceiling that whispered threats in the wind, and the constant possibility of death by chamber pot. If you were lucky, you had enough space to lie down diagonally. If you weren't, well, maybe you learned how to sleep standing up. Roman innovation wasn't all aqueducts and marble statues after all. Some tenants paid daily, others weekly. Few could afford to pay monthly, because that required stability, and stability didn't live in an insula. The average labourer made just enough to cover food and rent, but rarely both with dignity, so you haggled, borrowed, or skipped meals, often all three in a good week. Now, let's talk landlords. You'd think someone profiting off these smoky death boxes might at least pretend to be human. You'd be wrong. Roman landlords were their own species, known as domini insularum. They ranged from ambitious merchants to senatorial elites who had never set foot in the neighborhoods they owned. Why would they? Their job was to collect, not to care. Maintenance? Non-existent. Repairs? Delayed until someone was crushed. Rats in the walls? Sounds like a you problem. The only thing a landlord moved quickly on was evicting someone who couldn't cough up the cash. And yes, they had enforcers. Muscle. People whose job it was to knock, glare, and ensure your tiny slice of misery kept producing income. You didn't have to be late more than once to end up on the street, your belongings dumped, your family homeless, and your room promptly re-rented to someone more desperate. Imagine this. You've been living in a third-floor unit for 2 years. You've patched your own wall. You've hauled your own water. You've survived 3 minor fires and 1 major rat infestation. And suddenly, rent goes up. No explanation, no improvement, just a higher number scrawled on a wax tablet, and the charming face of your landlord's assistant grunting, "Pay up." And if you dared to complain, that's cute. Complaining meant nothing. You had no contract, no recourse, and no voice. It wasn't take it or leave it. It was take it and thank me, or sleep in the street with the fish guts. Modern comparison? Imagine paying $1,800 a month to share a closet in Brooklyn without the Wi-Fi, plumbing, or structural integrity. Now picture that closet occasionally catching fire, and your landlord is also your magistrate. And your only neighbor is a guy who butchers goats at 3 a.m. That's Roman renting. Still, some people got clever. Tenants would sublet to others, cramming extra families into rooms that already resembled storage cupboards. It wasn't legal, but it delayed eviction. Others joined associations, early versions of tenant collectives, to help cover rent during hard times. Mutual aid, because if the building collapsed, at least everyone could blame the same guy. And that guy, he was still getting richer. Real estate in Rome was lucrative. With so many poor citizens packed into one city, landlords could rake in thousands of sesterces, while offering less structural support than a pile of damp cardboard. Property taxes were manageable, and the risks passed directly onto the tenants. If the building collapsed, insurance wasn't a thing. You just built another, faster, cheaper. Let's not sugarcoat it. Renting in an insula wasn't just unfair. It was a slow-motion robbery, wrapped in plaster and optimism. You paid not for comfort, but for the chance at survival. A room without holes, a stair that didn't break, a ceiling that stayed put. That was the dream, and people still chased it. Because Rome meant work, opportunity, bread. Spectacle. Maybe you couldn't afford safety, but you could afford proximity to the Forum, to the Colosseum, to hope. And sometimes, proximity was worth the price of uncertainty. But then, At the end of the week, when the grain was running low and the water jar was empty, there came that knock on the door, the rent collector, back again, asking for payment with the same blank expression and the same tired phrase, due today. And you, exhausted, aching, itchy from fleas, with one eye on the cracks in the ceiling, would reach into your pouch and pray there were enough coins. Because in the Roman Empire, poverty didn't kill you quickly, it just billed you monthly. In a Roman Insula, privacy wasn't a right, it was a myth, like unicorns or clean stairwells. You didn't just live near your neighbors, you lived with them, on them, through them. Every cough, every shout, every snore and bodily function shared freely through walls, as thin as papyrus and twice as flammable. Let's be clear, the average insula was a sardine can with ideas above its station. Dozens, sometimes hundreds of people crammed into one vertical pile of brick and timber. Families, widows, beggars, barbers, fishmongers, failed actors, retired soldiers, all stacked into tiny rooms, separated by mold and misplaced ambition. There was no soundproofing, no personal space, no such thing as me time. If your neighbor decided to learn the flute at midnight, you were part of the recital, whether you liked it or not. Your walls, made of compressed dust and disappointment, they absorbed nothing, reflected everything, and offered exactly zero buffer between you and the chaos of communal living. The man in the next room had marital problems. You knew because he shouted about them every night. The woman below had 6 children and an aggressive relationship with a cooking pot. The guy above you practiced oratory for 6 hours a day, loudly, and seemed to be losing every debate. And let's not forget the smells. Fish, sweat, stew, smoke, urine, goat. Repeat. Your nose was never bored. Every mealtime turned your home into a scented melting pot of cheap food and questionable hygiene. There were no fans, no chimneys, and no escape. If your neighbor burned garlic, you lived with garlic. If they boiled onions, you cried with them. And if they made garum, the fermented fish sauce of Roman nightmares, well, so did your curtains. Now let's talk conflict. In this powder keg of proximity, tempers flared like Roman candles. Disputes over space, noise, smell, water jugs, or who left the door open again were common. Arguments often started with a muttered insult and escalated into full-blown theatrical duels of shouting, cursing, and occasionally weaponry, knives, clubs, furniture. It was less domestic dispute and more gladiatorial warm-up. There are recorded cases, real, legal documents, of neighbors suing each other over everything from spilled chamber pots to goats chewing through walls. Yes, goats, because sometimes your neighbor's idea of home decor included livestock. The hallways, such as they were, became communal battlegrounds. Shared spaces turned into contested zones. Whose bucket is this? Who moved my amphora? Who knocked over my idol of Mercury? People left petty graffiti. They bribed others to sabotage competitors. They gossiped like Olympic athletes. It wasn't just annoying, it was performance art. And yet, amid all this chaos, bonds formed. Humans, after all, are stubbornly social. You might hate your neighbor's constant singing, but when their ceiling collapsed, you still helped dig them out. When the fire came, you shouted for them. When the city's grain shipment was late, you shared a crust of bread. Let that contradiction settle in. These were your tormentors and your lifelines. The same man who let his pig defecate outside your door might also lend you his blanket when yours was stolen. The widow who insulted your cooking might slip your child a fig on a feast day. It was loud, messy, infuriating, and utterly human. But still, some neighbors really were the worst. Like the man who dumped his waste out the window and didn't even pretend to yell, "Watch out!" The one who played the tibia, a reed instrument designed by the devil, for hours, badly, or the woman who collected clay dolls and talked to them, loudly, about you. And sometimes, things got darker. Jealousy, theft, violence. You couldn't lock your doors, they barely shut. If you owned something valuable, you either hid it, sat on it, or slept with one eye open. Resentment brewed. Occasionally it boiled. The stairwell became a crime scene. The walls absorbed screams as easily as they did gossip. But you didn't leave. You couldn't. The rent was too high elsewhere. The city was too crowded. And besides, this was your corner of Rome. Cracked, smoky, vibrating with tension and life. It was your cliffhanger. What happens when tempers flare and weapons are involved? Things get Roman. You've heard the shouting. You've smelled the stew. You've sidestepped the rats. Now, add a crying child at 3 a.m. Not your child, mind you, but one room over, and you have the full Roman tenement package. Welcome to parenting in an insula. Less warm family memories, and more co-sleeping with vermin and respiratory infections. Children in ancient Rome weren't just miniature citizens. They were smaller, weaker tenants who cried, tripped and inhaled the same mouldy air as everyone else. If you were born into an insula, your life started with a whimper, continued through a cough, and, with any luck, didn't end under a collapsed beam. Let's start with the birth itself. Privacy? Forget it. Women gave birth in rooms the size of a broom closet, surrounded by screaming neighbors, moaning livestock, and helpful advice shouted from 2 floors below. Midwives came if you could afford them. Otherwise, you got your mother, your sister, and hope. And once the baby arrived, welcome to the insula. Kid, don't mind the crumbling ceiling, we don't talk about him. Babies cried constantly. Of course. Hunger, heat, cold, the subtle trauma of being alive in a tenement built by a man with no formal education and a hammer. Their cries echoed through the walls, bouncing down stairwells, mingling with the clatter of broken dishes and the occasional distant brawl. They weren't just background noise, they were the soundtrack. But the crying wasn't the problem. The air was choking. Smoke was an inescapable reality. Cooking fires, oil lamps, incense burned to mask the smell of chamber pots. All of it produced smoke, and the insula trapped it like a jar traps flies. There were no chimneys, no vents, just soot-coloured walls and lungs that aged in dog years. Infants inhaled it constantly. So did toddlers. So did mothers. Coughing wasn't an ailment, it was a lullaby. Respiratory infections were rampant. By age 5, a Roman tenement child had already weathered more air quality warnings than a lifetime in modern Beijing. But if they survived infancy, and that was a big if, they still faced the delights of insular life. No playground, no yard, no personal space. Children played in stairwells, in alleys, under carts, beside communal latrines. They fashioned toys out of scraps. A carved stick, a lump of clay, a rock with imagination. Childhood wasn't whimsical, it was jury-rigged. Education? Not guaranteed. Boys might go to school if their parents could spare the coin. Girls? Not usually. Most kids learned by watching, doing, surviving. You learned to carry water jugs before your arms could hold them. You memorized street vendor calls before you knew your own full name. Illness, again, was ever present. Diarrhea, parasites, fevers. There wasn't a clean surface in your life, and no one had heard of a germ. Baths were public and infrequent. Soap was a luxury. Cuts festered, eyes crusted, teeth rotted. If you lost a tooth at 7, no one called it adorable. They checked if the others were falling out too. Yet somehow, among all the noise and filth, kids laughed. They played tag down corridors, slick with old wine. They snuck fruit from distracted vendors. They chased cats, threw pebbles, invented rules to games on the spot. Childhood still found a way, even when every inch of space said, "Don't touch anything." Parents tried their best. They told stories at night, shared their food, held their children tight on nights when the wind howled and the walls shook. Sometimes they whispered prayers, sometimes just apologies. And the grief, because yes, there was grief. Children died, frequently. A fever, a fall, a fire, a simple cold. The average Roman mother buried at least one child. Some buried more. The losses were heavy, but silence wasn't the custom. Grief was public, shared, screamed from windows and doorways. The city mourned with you, even if the mourning was drowned out by market noise a few minutes later. Imagine raising a child here. Then remember people did. For centuries. The Insula wasn't built for childhood. It wasn't built for life, really. Just for living barely. Yet, somehow, children were born, raised, loved, and occasionally thrived. They learned to balance clay bowls on their heads, to run on uneven floors without falling, to sleep through shouting and wake up to smoke. It wasn't a childhood of comfort. It was one of resilience. And maybe that's why they grew up fast, because the world around them didn't wait. Every few years in ancient Rome, a man in a toga would knock on your door, or what passed for one, and ask a deceptively simple question. Where do you live? Sounds harmless, right? Except this wasn't just for directions or friendly small talk. This was the census, and in the Roman Empire, your answer did more than tell people your location. It announced your value. The census was the ultimate societal receipt. It tracked citizens, counted property, assessed taxes, and, most brutally of all, labeled your social worth with bureaucratic precision. And, for the average Insula dweller, it was a ritual reminder that the empire knew exactly how little it cared about your existence. If you lived in a domos, a spacious ground-level home with a garden and a family shrine, your name might have been logged with a wink and a nod. Respectable. Important. A man of means. But if your address read something like 6th floor, rear unit next to the fishmonger with the screaming child, then congratulations, you were officially among Rome's vast, disposable underclass. The Romans didn't just judge you for being poor. They built a system to document it. The census was both meticulous and merciless. It recorded your wealth in land, slaves, property, and family. If your tally added up to something impressive, you were marked as part of the Aquaites, or even the senatorial class. If it didn't, well, welcome to the long list of names that would be buried under bureaucracy and bird droppings. Living in an insula wasn't just physically difficult, it was socially radioactive. These buildings were the architectural equivalent of a scarlet letter. No matter how clean you kept your room, how honest your labor, or how many prayers you whispered to household gods, your address told the world, this one, not important. The shame wasn't subtle, it was systemic. In public, senators and patricians strolled past tenement blocks without a glance, as though acknowledging them might invite lice or taxes. In forums and courts, your address could determine how seriously your voice was taken. Want to testify as a witness? Good luck if you came from the Subira, Rome's notoriously crowded insula-ridden district. Your honesty came second to your postal code. Let's pause here. How much of your identity is tied to your address? Even today, we measure status by zip codes, by square footage, by skyline views. It's not just a Roman thing, it's a human thing. But Rome did it with the full weight of imperial administration. Your name went on a wax tablet, your possessions were catalogued, and your status became public record. And no matter how hard you worked, the census was like gravity constantly pulling you back down. Back in your insula, none of this was theoretical. You felt it daily, in the way shopkeepers watched you, in the way magistrates brushed you off, in the way employers offered fewer coins than promised. Because what were you going to do? Sue them? The census didn't just record inequality, it amplified it. Now let's say you wanted to move up, change your status, earn more, move out, get closer to a respectable life. The system made that extremely difficult. Wealth didn't just fall into your lap. Social mobility existed, sure, but it moved slower than a mule cart in August. Most Insula residents died where they lived, sometimes quite literally under the rubble of it. And if the building collapsed, the census clerk would just scratch a line through your name and keep going. Yet, for all this, people still took the census seriously. It was proof you existed, proof that in some dusty archive or temple office, your name was carved into history. However faintly, families would gather to declare their status with pride, even if their roof leaked and their ceiling groaned. Because dignity is stubborn, because hope can bloom even in smoke-stained stairwells. And sometimes it would. A child born in an insula might become a trader, might earn enough to buy property, might climb the social ladder, not by invitation, but by clawing, sweating, scraping their way up, floor by floor. The census would then log a new address, a better one, and somewhere a clerk would raise an eyebrow, surprised. So, yes, the census came with shame, but it also came with visibility, a record. A reminder that even the lowliest tenant was a thread in Rome's vast tapestry, often frayed, often forgotten, but there, and that mattered. It's dawn in Rome. The insula is groaning, stretching, exhaling decades of mold and bad sleep. You wipe the soot from your eyes, grab your worn sandals, and brace yourself for what passes as the morning commute. Spoiler, it's not scenic, it's not relaxing. It's a daily contact sport fought against humanity, gravity, and livestock. First challenge, the stairs. They're narrow, steep, and likely occupied by 3 other people trying to do the exact same thing. You sidestep a child, duck under someone's laundry, and nearly lose your footing on something suspiciously sticky. Finally, you make it to the ground floor, where the air already smells like heat, fish, and wet dog. Now comes the real adventure. The street. Roman streets weren't designed for comfort, or speed, or, frankly, humans. They were noisy, chaotic, and utterly without rules. There were no sidewalks, no traffic lights, no concept of personal space. The road belonged to everyone, and no one. You stepped into a stew of humanity, merchants shouting prices, street performers juggling knives, dangerously close to pedestrians, pickpockets pretending to be blind, and then there were the carts, lumbering wooden beasts pulled by stubborn donkeys or barely contained oxen, driven by men who hadn't read a single etiquette scroll in their lives. Crossing the street? A test of will. You watched for breaks in traffic. Not that anyone slowed down, and timed your sprint between a fish cart and a funeral procession. Slip once, and it was over. A wheel to the foot, a donkey to the gut, a very embarrassing obituary. Add in the open sewers. That's right, Rome's famed Cloaca Maxima might have drained the city's worst filth, but street-level runoff, still a problem. You dodged puddles of mystery. A dead pigeon here. A slushing amphora of something you hope is wine there. Your sandals were never clean, your dignity missing in action. But let's say you made it a few blocks without injury. Great. Now comes the bottleneck. The Forum. Picture Times Square on garbage day, but with more political yelling and fewer pants. Every citizen, senator, slave, and street preacher passed through the same corridors of commerce and chaos. Arguments flared. Deals were struck. Someone probably got slapped with a scroll. Claustrophobia was mandatory. You didn't walk, you shuffled, pressed on all sides. Someone breathed down your neck. Someone else sneezed in your face. You stepped on a sandal and heard a curse that might have been legally binding. You passed a man selling eels from a wooden crate. The eels were alive. The man was not smiling. And then the shouting started. Rome was always on edge. One tax too high. One gladiator match delayed. One grain shortage. Suddenly, the crowd turned. Mobs formed faster than thunder. If you were unlucky enough to be commuting during a riot, your options were run, hide, or climb a statue and pray to Jupiter. Sometimes the chaos wasn't even political. Sometimes it was just people. Rome was a city of over 1 million souls packed into a footprint smaller than modern Manhattan. Crowds weren't special. They were constant. You got jostled, bumped, shoved, groped, insulted, and everyone just carried on like it was normal. Because it was. So you learned to adapt, to slide between elbows, to duck low, under wine cellars, to spot the early signs of a donkey about to kick. You kept your coin purse tucked deep in your tunic. You stopped reacting when someone shouted, because it was probably just another fishmonger arguing with a drunk. Let that sink in. Just getting to your destination could feel like surviving a battlefield. No chariots for you. No litter bearers. You didn't glide through Rome. You endured it. And yet, it worked. Somehow, everyone got where they needed to go. Bakers reached their ovens. Scribes reached their benches. Prostitutes reached their corners. Even the emperor got where he was going, though admittedly, he had guards clearing the way with loud sticks. Still, the Insula resident trudged on, every single day, from crumbling stairwell to chaotic street, just to earn enough to pay for the privilege of doing it all again tomorrow. Modern comparison? Imagine a Monday morning commute through Times Square during a garbage strike, with no crosswalks, one working shoe, a full bladder, and a cart of squid chasing you. That's the vibe. But hey, at least it wasn't raining. You've survived your commute. You've dodged carts, sewage, stray elbows, and the occasional eel. You've paid your rent, endured your neighbors, and maybe, just maybe, you've dared to dream of a better life, a cleaner room, a quieter night, a ceiling that doesn't sag like a philosophical metaphor. But here's the catch. In ancient Rome, if you wanted to escape the insula, you better have coin, and lots of it. Social mobility existed in theory. A freedman could become wealthy. A merchant could rise. A soldier could earn land. But for the average tenement dweller, moving up was more poetic than practical. The system was designed to keep you exactly where you were, sweating in the rafters, choking on plaster dust, and paying a landlord who didn't know your name. The insula was the trap. But the domus was the prize. Domus, the luxurious Roman home of the elite. A single-story palace of mosaics, courtyards, columns, and whispering fountains. These weren't just homes. They were declarations, status, wealth, citizenship. Inside, you might find frescoes of gods, marble floors polished by barefoot servants, and private baths filled with rosewater. The kind of place where your footsteps echoed, and no one cooked fish next to your bed. You, in contrast, were heating lentils in a clay bowl over a flickering fire while your neighbor sneezed into your window. So how did people cross the line? Very carefully, and usually not at all. First, you needed money, lots of it. Enough to buy land or bribe a patron. You needed a network, someone to vouch for you. And you needed luck. The kind of luck that meant your business didn't burn down, your ship didn't sink, and your children didn't eat the lead-painted walls. The few who made it out became urban legends. Cato, once poor, rose through political grit. Trimalchio, yes, that Trimalchio, was a freed slave who became so rich he threw dinner parties with flamingos and synchronized dancers. But for every Trimalchio, there were 10,000 Gaiuses still sweeping pigeon bones off their sixth-floor doorstep. And those who did escape the insula often pretended they hadn't, because status in Rome was fragile. You couldn't just be rich, you had to look rich, walk right, speak right, wear the correct number of rings, and have the appropriate number of sycophants trailing behind you. And if you slipped even once, the city would notice. Let's say you somehow scraped together enough to rent a room on a lower floor. That alone could change how others saw you. Proximity to the ground wasn't just about safety. It was about respect. From there, maybe you saved enough to move to a smaller domus in a quiet district. Maybe you got invited to dinner with someone important. Maybe, gasp, you became important. But most never got close. They stayed in their rooms. In the back, near the stairs. Up in the heat, watching the rich glide past and litters. Perfume wafting behind them like smugness in mist form. The closest many ever got to a domus was scrubbing the floors, or delivering figs through the servants' entrance. So what did they do instead? They adapted. They built lives within the constraints, made art on cheap plaster, wrote poems in charcoal, found beauty in hand-me-down tunics, whispered dreams into the smoky air while washing out bowls with rainwater, and sometimes they laughed harder than anyone inside a marble atrium ever could. Still, the dream lingered. The escape. One woman, her name lost to history, was born in an insula in the Subura district. Dirt poor, father gone, she sold herbs with her mother. Later she apprenticed with a midwife, then opened her own clinic. By 40 she'd moved into a modest domus near the Aventine Hill. Nothing grand, but it had a roof that didn't leak, a fire that didn't threaten her life, and a window that faced a tree instead of a wall. She became a legend in her neighborhood. Not for being rich, but for getting out, for beating the odds, for surviving long enough to rewrite her address. So yes, escape was possible, but only if you were persistent, or brilliant, or blessed by every god from Jupiter to Janus. For most, it was just a fantasy. The domus was a postcard, a myth, a place you passed on the way to the market, eyes lowered, heart tight, because inside someone was reclining on a couch, nibbling grapes, and wondering if their slave had watered the impluvium. Meanwhile, your roof just shed another tile. Cliffhanger. One woman escaped Insula life and became a legend. How? Every tenant in a Roman insula lived with an unspoken truth. One day, their home might crumble beneath them, not metaphorically, but literally. Walls would crack, ceilings would sag, floors would give way, and sometimes the entire building would collapse in a cloud of dust, screams, and broken dreams. It was the most dramatic punctuation mark to a life already full of uncertainty. Ancient records tell stories of these collapses, snapshots of tragedy frozen in time. One account from the late Republic tells of a multi-story insula in the Subura district that gave way without warning. Tenants were trapped beneath heaps of timber and brick. Rescue efforts were chaotic, hampered by narrow alleys and frightened crowds. The event sent shockwaves through the city, but it was hardly unusual. What caused these collapses? Poor construction, of course. Builders cutting corners to squeeze out another floor. Rotten beams hidden by layers of plaster. Foundations weakened by water seeping in through leaky roofs. All of it compounded by neglect. Landlords unwilling or unable to invest in repairs that didn't promise immediate returns. Imagine living day to day knowing the ceiling above your head might one day become your coffin lid. The tension, the constant checking of walls for new cracks, the prayer that tonight won't be the night. For some, this wasn't anxiety, it was routine. On that fateful day, a small crack might appear near the doorway. It looks innocent at first, almost like a harmless blemish. Then the plaster crumbles, dust falls, a beam creaks. The groaning grows louder, and before anyone can scream, the ceiling caves in. People fell, children were trapped, families lost everything in seconds. There were no safety nets, no insurance, no emergency shelters, just rubble and silence. Let that sink in. The fragile boundary between home and grave was thinner than you thought. Survivors sometimes wandered the streets, dazed, carrying what little they could salvage. Others disappeared into the crowd, seeking refuge with relatives or strangers. The city, brutal as ever, moved on. Buildings were rebuilt, sometimes sturdier, often were. In literature, collapses became symbols of social decay and neglect. Poets and philosophers lamented the moral rot, reflected in crumbling walls. Yet for most residents, the collapse was a personal catastrophe, not a metaphor. It was the sudden loss of shelter, security, and community. Think about the families who lost everything. Where did they go? What did they eat? How did they sleep? The insula was more than bricks. It was life itself. When it fell, lives fell with it. And yet, remarkably, people kept returning to rebuild, to resettle, to hope, because Rome was their world. And no matter how fragile, no matter how dangerous, the insula was home. Dust settled, silence fell, and life, stubborn, and relentless, began again. Walk through the ruins of Rome today, and you'll find marble arches, lonely columns, and fragments of mosaic floors, echoes of emperors and generals, not the ordinary souls who lived stacked atop each other in the city's insulae. The grand monuments are everywhere, preserved for selfies and textbooks, but the ghosts of the tenements, they're mostly dust swept away by centuries of rebuilding, buried under markets, parking lots, and the relentless churn of history. What remains of Insula life? A cracked brick here, a soot-blackened fragment of wall there, unearthed by archaeologists with brushes finer than a senator's hairpiece. Occasionally an entire block emerges from beneath modern roads, a honeycomb of small rooms, communal corridors, narrow stairwells, the bones of Rome's real city, laid bare by patient hands. There's irony in this. The ordinary Romans, the ones who baked the bread, swept the forums, and filled the stadiums, left almost nothing behind. They built nothing meant to last. No marble, no grand inscription. Their stories, their laughter, their losses, all faded into anonymity as surely as the line in their crumbling walls. But their shadows linger if you know where to look. In the ancient Subura district, under layers of rubble and new construction, excavators found evidence of collapsed tenements and hurried repairs. Clay lamps stamped with the names of tenants, cheap pottery decorated with scratched-in doodles, children's games, prayers, insults, a child's sandal, a rusted door hinge. Tiny fragments of the millions who lived and died in buildings no tourist ever photographs. Sometimes, in the dirt, they find skeletons. Men and women with worn joints, crooked spines, and teeth ground down by years of hard bread and harder living. Infants, buried quickly, without ceremony, beneath floorboards that once rattled with the sounds of family life. There's no monument for these ghosts, just silent testimony. They were here. They mattered. Pause here. These weren't ancient people. They were just people, like you. They worried about the rent, argued with their neighbors, hoped for a better future for their children, laughed at stupid jokes, fell in love, cried in the dark, endured winter, dreamed of summer. Theirs was a history without statues, a legacy of survival, written in sweat and soot rather than ink and gold. Today, scholars piece together their lives from what little is left. The graffiti scratched in a stairwell, declaring, "Flavia loves Marcus," or cursing a thieving neighbor. An abandoned toy, a kitchen hearth, blackened by 100 evening meals, nothing grand, everything intimate. And so the insulae live on, not as monuments, but as memories. Stories half told, glimpsed in the gaps between stones. There the city's missing chapters, the crowded margins to every grand epic. When you walk through modern Rome, you're walking on the roofs of their lives, layer after layer, a human city buried beneath a marble one. Their ghosts are gentle. They don't haunt out of malice or anger. They linger out of longing to be remembered, even for a moment, as more than a footnote. The grand emperors built their legacies in stone and gold. The tenement dwellers built theirs in heartbeats, millions of them, echoing still beneath the streets in the dust and the air. So if you ever visit Rome and feel a shiver that isn't from the wind, say hello. You're surrounded by ghosts, ordinary, extraordinary, unbreakable. Let's settle this once and for all. Could you, 21st century comfort connoisseur, last a single night in a Roman insula? You, with your smart mattress, double glazed windows, and emotional support Wi-Fi. Take a deep breath. Let's walk through an hour-by-hour survival sim and see how you stack up against the world's most unglamorous tenement. Mid-evening, you squeeze into a space smaller than your college dorm closet, dodging a neighbor's elbow and a rogue clay jar. It's humid. The air is thick with garum, sweat, and that special scent known only to civilizations without Febreze. You set down your belongings, a threadbare tunic, a chipped cup, and whatever hope you have left for a decent night's sleep. You're hungry. There's no fridge. No takeout. No just popping to the kitchen. You wander the street for food, sidestepping rats and puddles of unknown origin. Maybe you buy lentils from a vendor. Maybe you haggle for a hunk of bread with more grain than gravel. You return home, climb 5 rickety flights in the dark, and realize you forgot water. Down and up again, each step creaking like it's about to give you a starring role in Collapse the Home Edition. You try to wash, sort of. There's a bucket. It's cold. The soap is a luxury you haven't seen in months. You splash your face, shiver, and call it clean. Now it's time for some me time, which in a Roman insula means lying perfectly still, trying not to touch the walls or inhale too deeply. You hear every word from your neighbor's argument 2 rooms over. You hear someone above you emptying their chamber pot. You hear a baby wail, a dog bark, a distant cough that sounds suspiciously contagious. You hear basically all of Rome's greatest hits. The building groans. A plank shifts. You get that sinking feeling. No, not just existential dread, but the actual physical anxiety that the roof beams are plotting against you. You think about sleep. You think about escape plans. You think about that dream where your bed is on fire and wonder if it's a prophecy. Midnight. Someone's drunk. Someone's crying. Someone's playing an instrument no one can name. The air thickens as fires burn in every room. Tiny, hungry, desperate for oxygen. You try to block it out. Maybe you pray. Maybe you count cracks in the ceiling. Maybe you make a promise to the gods, to Mercury or Vesta, or any deity who might care enough to keep the walls upright until morning. Suddenly a shout. The unmistakable crack of timber. A scramble on the stairs. The voice screaming for help. For a moment your heart stops. You wait. Is it your floor? Is it tonight? Minutes pass. The panic ebbs. Not this time. You try to sleep again, curled under a blanket scratchier than your conscience, bracing yourself for every new sound. Eventually exhaustion wins. Your dreams are strange, haunted by fire and rats and the ghostly echoes of 1,000 whispered lives. Dawn. You survived. The building stands. You blink in the pale light, shivering, relieved, amazed. You made it through the worst night imaginable, and all you got was, well, a headache and a new appreciation for central heating. Could you do this every night? Let's be honest. Probably not. The Romans did. Somehow, they survived the stairs, the noise, the filth, the fires, the floods, the heartbreak, the rent and each other. They endured, not because they were superhuman, but because there was no other option. They built lives, families, whole communities in places most of us wouldn't last until midnight. Maybe boring history isn't so boring when it's about staying alive. So, still think your apartment's bad? Next time your Wi-Fi drops, just be glad the ceiling isn't. If you made it this far, you deserve a night in a fireproof bed and a subscription. Like, subscribe, and sleep easy knowing you never had to dodge flaming timber just to use the bathroom. So, still think your apartment's bad? Next time your Wi-Fi drops, just be glad the ceiling isn't. If you made it this far, you deserve a night in a fireproof bed and a subscription. Like, subscribe, and sleep easy knowing you never had to dodge flaming timber just to use the bathroom.